All right. And I am going to share, I think. See if this will go. All right. Do you guys see a PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure. All right. Well, so welcome to the Houston Beekeepers Association. This is our second virtual Zoom meeting, and we're so glad to have all of you with us. Just to let you know what we're going to be covering today, a few quick announcements at the beginning of our meeting, and we have a great guest speaker, Danny Weaver, who's going to be talking about honey production today. We'll have some questions and answers after his presentation and sharing with us. And then, of course, hold out till the end of our meeting because we have our raffle, and we have lots of things to raffle today that we're very excited to share with you all. So to jump into our announcements, the very first one, as normal, is to share about the Houston Beekeepers Association and all the amazing things you get by being a member. And for students, that's 15, for individuals, 25, and for families, 40. And of course, you get these amazing meetings with amazing speakers that we bring in, but you also get to connect with the community of beekeepers. So please consider supporting the association. Those dollars go to great speakers and other activities that the association puts on. And of course, if you're a member, you can borrow our equipment, which includes extractors and those types of things that you might not want to purchase on your own. So please think about contributing. You can follow our Facebook or the website to pay your annual dues, which are January to December. So one thing of note, guess what tomorrow is? It is World Bee Day. Like, seriously, tomorrow. So there are a lot of things going on, presentations, virtual, meetings and different conferences. So please take the opportunity to link to the ones we've put into the Facebook site, which there's also a link of opportunities that are in the SCEP that went out this month. And we'll also raffle a ticket to World Bee Day on the end of our meeting today. So lots of things to do. Definitely, if you've got kids, lots of activities you can do around Bee Day that are actually on those websites. But that will definitely keep you busy all day if you don't have other things to do. Although I'm sure we're all busy working from home. So it's a great way to share our passion for the bees and also learn a lot on World Bee Day. All right, so with that, I want to turn it over to Danny Weaver. For those of you who are not aware, him and his family have been caring and keeping bees and selling bees for many years, literally since what, the 1800s? 1888 to be exact. Beeweaver is in Navasota, just up the road a little bit. Lots of tours and lessons, of course, to learn how to beekeep. And of course, they have amazing bees and queens. And so I'm really excited to share him with you today and have him give us some education and lesson learned around maximizing our honey production. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Danny.
Okay, great. Can you hear me? Is my audio okay?
I can hear you.
All right, well, I'm very privileged to be able to join your group. I must say it's mighty impressive to have the Houston Area Beekeepers Association have as many members as it must have to muster this many to a meeting. Because when I was a little boy, not too many years ago, it was hard to get this many people to a Texas Beekeepers Association meeting. So it's gratifying to know that so many more people are keeping bees these days and are involved in beekeeping. And I know that you all probably enjoy it as I do. It's a endlessly fascinating avocation for some and vocation for others. And, if you're the typical backyard beekeeper, you're keeping bees for one of three reasons. You want to pollinate your garden, you want to produce honey, or you want to help preserve pollinator populations. And it's hard to avoid honey production in some parts of the world. And I think Houston area beekeepers are lucky in that regard, because for many people, you have to think about, okay, where are the blooming nectar producing plants? Am I going to have to pick up my bees and move them to get on a honey flow to produce substantial quantities of honey? And luckily for those of you in the Houston area, you don't have to do that, because the honey flow comes to you most years. In fact, very, very few years has there been a complete crop failure in Harris County. So count yourselves fortunate for that. In fact, I think you could say that there are probably at least 3 major honey flows in the Houston area. And right now you ought to be in the beginning stages of the middle one, the main one. And I must say that I was a bit chastened to be asked to talk about maximizing honey production, because we've had one of the poorest springs on record in terms of honey production in most of our area of central Texas. And we don't keep as many bees in Harris County and Fort Bend County and Brazoria County as we once did. And that's really about the only sunny spot in our spring honey production, is further south, where presumably many of you all are. I think, the most important things you can do to maximize honey production are things that probably most of you did 2 months ago, or a month ago, or 3 weeks ago, and it's now a little too late to start a new colony if you intend to maximize honey production. But the honey flow is often so good in the Houston area this time of year that you actually could start a colony as late as the first part of June and make some honey. So, don't be discouraged if you feel like you're behind the curve based upon some of the things I talk about and some of the comments and questions that we get later on. It's never too late to start, and there's a good chance that you could have harvestable honey, even if you began with a nuke, a package, a split, a gifted hive, whatever, in the near future. So I guess I should back up and give you a little background about me and my family. And thanks for the kind introduction, Sandra. We have been involved in bees and beekeeping in Texas for a long time. And I learned a lot about honey production from my grandfather and my father, who were both great beekeepers. And I think the most important thing for maximizing honey production is having a strong, healthy populous colony. So to the extent that you can build your colony up and get it ready for the honey flow, you need to do that. You need to have it where it's literally boiling over with bees when the honey flow starts, if you're going to maximize honey production. Now, bees will do that naturally. So, that's our great gift, is that we're working with an organism that really wants to do what we want it to do. And so a colony in Texas that overwinters on good stores in the typical year will have enough nectar flow coming in beginning in sometimes as early as late January, early February, when red buds begin to bloom for sure. Dewberries begin to bloom. Other brush plants begin to bloom, red haw, black haw, and the list goes on from there. If your bees are growing coming out of winter and have adequate stores, they will turn the honey reserves they have into bees, and they will be ready to capitalize on the major nectar flows when they happen. So, really your job as a beekeeper is to intervene to the extent that you need to help them get where they should be and where they want to be anyway. And this year, in my part of the world anyway, you needed to be feeding bees much more than you typically have to in Texas. So we had many colonies in places where we would typically expect to have at this juncture a full super or two of honey on board, even as we were harvesting many, many thousands of bees from every colony to raise queens or produce packages and nukes with. And this year it just didn't happen. Unless we were feeding them, they were on the brink of starvation all spring long until very recently. So I think it's important to remember that we all have to deal with the vagaries of seasonality, and on top of that, we've got new variables in play because of climate change and urbanization, suburbanization, and landscape ecology, which has an enormous influence on how much honey you're going to produce. You're lucky that so many of the plants that are used as ornamentals or planted in Houston naturally as part of just establishing a plant community around your house are also pretty good honey plants. So take advantage of it because it's right out your front door. So, okay, we got number one, strong colony of bees ready to go make honey. Of course, it helps to have a young queen to do that, right? The older your queen is, the less likely it is to be maximally productive. The amount of honey that you can produce is going to be based upon how many foraging bees you have, which ultimately is a function of how many bees you have in the colony. And so that shouldn't go unsaid. Now, I was encouraged to see the summary of the poll results, or at least what I could glean from the chat responses. It looks like most of you have put on supers. That's the second most important thing to do. And if you're going to maximize honey production, you're not going to make any honey unless you give the bees a place to put it. Because when the honey flow hits and all they have is a hive body or two to occupy, they're quickly going to fill that up. And then they're going to move into swarm mode if they don't have adequate space. So I would encourage all of you who haven't yet supered your colony to think seriously about doing that, because based on what I saw when I was in northern Harris County last week and the reports I've got from employees this week, the honey flow is on. You better get some supers on because they're about to blow up. And in the Houston area, you know, just one super is probably not going to tide you over if you've got a big, strong colony. You probably need 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 supers on, depending upon how populous your colony is and how many nectar resources you have available to you. Now, you don't have to put all those supers on at the same time, but it helps to have them available because you can be amazed how quickly colonies will fill up around here. When the tallow flow hits and it comes in on top of wildflowers and brush plants, and bees are making honey off literally anything and everything, they can put in a super of honey in 4 or 5 days. That's all it takes. So you have to be ready to put those supers on, and the way you super matters too. If you have the strength and the stamina to do it, supering under is a great technique. That is adding empty supers below partially full honey supers. That will help maximize honey production because the honey production can be, the honey storage can be concentrated closer to the entrance. There are a number of other things you can do to maximize honey production. In Texas, we always give our colonies an upper entrance because so many of the foraging workers return, and if you give them a shortcut to where the honey needs to be stored, they'll take it. And not only that, but in the hot, humid environment of the Houston area, you want to try to encourage bees to evaporate as much moisture as they can out of the honey, because if you don't, you can end up with honey that's got a moisture content that is very high, so high in fact that once you extract it and store it, it will ferment. So if you give your colony an upper entrance, you're doing them a favor in that regard as well. Not only are you maximizing honey production, that is giving them a shortcut into the honey supers as they return from foraging bouts, you're also giving them a way to get rid of the water vapor more efficiently. Okay, so I've been on a roll now for quite a while here. Let me back up and say, Is anybody copying me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
And to the extent that anything I say provokes questions or thoughts, or you want further clarification or elaboration, please jump in quickly. I think I'm going to resume. Can I go back to gallery mode when somebody's sharing a screen with me? You know?
I think so. I can also.
I would just, you know, what I was going to say is if people just raise their hand or give me a heads up or whatever, I'll try to yield to whomever might want to interject a question or a comment. Because, you know, I want to make sure that this monologue that I'm delivering is not veered off too far on a tangent away from what you all want to hear about.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about
questions, Danny, in the chat.
Oh,
there's a chat function.
Wendy Hager. Okay, Wendy, what's up? Hang on a second, Wendy. I'm trying to figure out. So I have to scroll down to you to pull up your chat? Is that what happened?
If you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a chat function.
Yeah, I hit it.
It will open a new window with questions. People are typing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't have it. Yeah. My dumb. Sorry here.
You're great. You're great.
I just hadn't toggled to the bottom. So what does an upper entrance look like? Right. So we provide upper entrances all over the place. So my hive bodies have, in addition to the entrance at the bottom of the colony, they also have a 1-inch hole drilled right underneath the handhole, angled up slightly so that rain doesn't enter the colony. And that is our first upper entrance, right? Each of my hive bodies has got a hole in it about yay big. Okay. And then once you put honey supers on, it's easy to give an upper entrance. All you have to do is offset one of the honey supers by like 3/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, just big enough so that bees can get in and out. And that will serve as a very fine upper entrance. Do beetles use this entrance too? Good question. I think beetles will get into a colony no matter what you do. I'm not sure whether having an upper entrance is going to make it worse. In my experience, it doesn't. And I'll yield to the floor if somebody else has got a contrary experience to share with us. So I don't think that's not a major problem. Move that down just a little bit so I can see more folks.
Now, Danny,
make a second entrance. I think that's the same.
You also buy lids that have an upper entrance. I think I've seen those too.
I'm sorry. Say it again.
Danny, can you buy upper like lids that have entrances to them?
Oh, I mean, yeah, you can. Sure, you can, and you can fashion your own, right? Lots of commercial beekeepers do the same thing that I do to hive bodies, only they do it to their lid. They drill a hole in their lid, so they've always got an upper entrance.
Yeah.
That's not my practice, but plenty of people do it, and so the 3 honey flows in Houston. When do they occur? So in my experience, most years, you're going to have a honey flow that starts in late March, early April, if not sooner. And it continues until about the first week of May. The second honey flow, in my view, starts roughly about the time Chinese tallow blooms begin to tip over. So if you look at your Chinese tallow blooms and they're 3 or 4 inches long and they're starting to move from the vertical position to the hanging position, that's a pretty good indicator, pardon me, that the second honey flow has begun. And then the third honey flow usually happens in the late summertime, and the second honey flow can last all the way until the 4th of July. It will encompass things that subsequently bloom after tallow, including cowitch and verbenas and boneset and things like that. So then you can get a fall honey flow or late summer honey flow that is the third honey flow in the Houston area. You can also have cotton if you're lucky enough to be around cotton, close enough so bees can forage on it and not so close that your bees get poisoned by the pesticides that are applied to cotton. There are not too many other agricultural crops that are grown in the Houston area that are going to provide significant nectar, but it can happen. You know, you can make watermelon honey. Doesn't happen often, but you can. So let's see. What else? Oh, so you've had people add propolis to the upper entrance. I assume they didn't like it. Well, you know, if you've given them that upper entrance and you haven't taken it away from them during the wintertime, they will definitely use propolis to at least reduce it. They can build their own entrance reducer with propolis, and that's another great thing about keeping bees in Texas and the Houston area in particular. There are abundant sources of plant sap, plant resins, and that's what bees use to make propolis with. So they can definitely help you determine what the optimal entrance, upper entrance, or even bottom entrance looks like. They'll stop it down if you've given them too much. And I'm trying to make sure I've tried to cover the questions. If I'm missing something, interject, please. The usual rule of thumb that I have with how to super colonies is to pay attention to what's happening in the top super and what's happening in the super below the top super. So if you open the lid of the colony, and this assumes, of course, that you know your colony's queen right, and it's healthy and it's strong, and it's already beginning to produce honey. If you open your colony and you see white comb in the top, any significant amount of fresh wax at all, I would add another super right away. And if you see like the super being half full, I would add 2 supers. Okay? And I'd go even further than that. I'm an aggressive believer in providing adequate space to your colony, because as my father said, the only honey super you almost certainly will not harvest honey from is the one that stays in the shop. So put them on your bees if you've got them. And if you go in your top super, you don't even see any bee activity there, but you crack down and the super below that, you've got bees working in that super, and you expect the honey flow to last at least a week longer, give them another. Okay? And remember, in Texas, you're in Houston, in the tallow flow in particular, that extra room provides more headspace for them to get rid of that moisture, and they need that, right? Because we all know how humid it can be in Houston. So give them extra room in the colony, give them that top entrance so they can get rid of that water vapor, and you can end up with nice, 18% moisture honey instead of high 19s, low 20s, which is going to be problematic if you intend to store it for any significant period of time, unless you're going to dry it or heat it and pasteurize it. Now we've covered all those subjects, but the other thing you can do that will help you maximize honey production, and I think I saw that some of you have already begun this, the other thing you can do is to harvest honey. And you can begin harvesting honey rather early. Just make sure you're harvesting honey that's already been cured and it's sealed. And you might want to have an instrument so that you can check the moisture level in your honey as you're extracting it to make sure you're not getting too far ahead of the curve. But bear in mind that colonies are, I hate to anthropomorphize too much about honeybees and how they're like humans, but every now and then it's important to make an observation that echoes what you can see in human behavior. if bees have like 5 supers of honey on them, or even 2 or 3 supers of honey on them, they don't work as hard to store more honey as if they don't have any supers of honey on them. So if you go in during the honey flow and you take all the honey away from them and give them empty boxes, they will fill those empty supers faster than if you put them on top, or even if you super under and leave the honey stores on them. They get into panic mode and go, oh my goodness, the honey flow is about to get away from us. We got to pile it in. And so if you really want to maximize honey production, in addition to having big, strong, healthy colonies full of bees that can go out and get it, and in addition to giving them plenty of room to put that honey in when they're bringing nectar back, if you'll take honey away from them during the honey flow, it'll increase their foraging activity, and they will store more honey than if you left 3 or 4 supers of honey on them. Super under. Okay, so everyone says you don't add until, I'm trying to read these out loud a little bit so I can kind of add, I probably answer 2 or 3 at once. I do not use a queen excluder on my honey production colonies. Feel free to do that, but remember that there's another name for a queen excluder, and it's honey excluder. Okay? So if you're going to put a honey excluder on, definitely give them a top entrance above that queen excluder, because then the foraging workers can return to the colony above the queen excluder. Give them a shortcut, right? If they're having to crawl through that queen excluder, it's going to be squeezing nectar out of their honey stomach before they ever get to the comb to store it, right? So if everyone says that you don't add a super until the current one is 80% full, I disagree with everyone. Okay? You've waited too long if your super is 80% full. Unless the honey flow is going to end tomorrow. And you never know when that is going to be, right? Until the honey flow ends. So don't worry about that. If you've got 2 or 3 combs of partially filled with honey in the top super, add another one if you got it. I mean, you know, it's all a function of what resources you have available too. Equipment is expensive. I get that. So you can't spend infinite resources at your first year to provide multiple honey supers for your colony maybe. But, you know, as you go forward, remember that you don't need to wait until the super is 80% full to give them another, in my view, especially if you super under. So supering under, for those of you who are not experienced with that technique, is you take off all the full supers and you put your empty supers on the bottom, right? So by bottom, what do I mean? Well, if you're running a queen excluder, it's going to be above the queen excluder, but it's going to be underneath the full honey supers, or at least some of them. It's not going to be at the top. It's going to be, you know, lower down in the stack, if you will. So, and the other thing to remember, okay, so we've mentioned equipment is expensive. Remember, there's more than one way to harvest honey. And you can get cut comb honey that is absolutely gorgeous out of a super that you just throw on top with no frames in it. Just let them build comb in it and put honey in it. And you can harvest it that way. You don't have to have all your honey in movable frames. If you're willing to go to the work to cut it out, and if you don't mind eating honey in the comb, some people love that, you know, just put a box on top and they'll fill it with honey. It's much more important to have movable frames down in the brood chamber. And I think it's easier to extract, of course, if you have movable frames. But you don't have to do it that way, particularly if economics is a major consideration for you. How big a hole for the upper entrance? So I use a 1-inch bit, 1-inch wood bit for creating my upper hole in my brood chambers. And my upper entrance for honey production is merely offsetting supers from one another. So it's not a nice neat stack. I'll actually scooch one super forward or backward in order to give them a way to sneak in right there. Or you can just have old beat up equipment like mine. There's always an upper entrance. All right, so I think I've covered the questions I've seen, but I may have missed some. Okay, what about rain when you stagger? Yeah, I mean, you do have to worry about that a little bit, but in my experience, that's minor. So it's not a major consideration unless you've got a hurricane. And bees are amazingly good at getting water out of the colony if they end up with any in it. And you don't, you know, you can make your upper entrance near the top so that you can use your cover to partially shield the upper entrance that you've provided from rain. Okay. Yeah, some people are saying they use a tiny little pencil-sized drill bit. I mean, any kind of hole is better than none. So I'm fine with that. You might want to put more than one, but even one is better than none. Okay. So let's see, what else can I tell you about maximizing honey production? Well, if you're really going to get serious about maximizing honey production, you might want to think about moving your bees too, because you know, we used to move our bees all over Texas for various honey flows, and we'd also move them, at least a portion of them, in the summertime to North Dakota and Montana. So if you're really, really serious about maximizing honey production, and you got to do the math to see whether it makes economic sense to do it this way. But you can always pick up your colonies and move them from one spot to another. When the honey flow ends in the northeast part of Houston, you can pick up your colonies and move them to the southwest part of Houston. They'll probably get on another honey flow. So there's always that to think about as well. That can be a lot of work. It's difficult to find good bee locations when it's not your property, but it's not impossible. It's more difficult than it once was because the available landscape for beekeeping is much reduced from what it was even 20 years ago. Yeah, an upper entrance is also good if there is any chance of flooding. Amen. Absolutely. You know, one of the big risks when you get bees underwater is they'll suffocate, even if they're underwater only for a little bit. If the entrance goes underwater and they don't have an upper entrance, they'll suffocate in short order. Pardon me. So if you give them an upper entrance, at least they can get oxygen, and some of the bees can crawl out of the colony and create space to keep the colony from overheating. Are certain types of bees better at storing honey? Yes, honeybees. But that's not a, that's a real issue, right? There are lazy bees. There are feedlot bees that will continue to produce brood as long as they're given sugar syrup, who can sit down in the middle of the biggest field of blooming clover you've ever seen in your life and never produce a pound. Because they're just, that's how they are. They just don't know what they're doing. And there are other bees that are very avid nectar foragers and storers and honey producers that will produce an amazing amount of honey in a very short period of time. So there's definitely a genetic influence on that trait. So I encourage you to look around and make sure that the bees that you've got, if you're interested in maximizing honey production, are actually good at producing honey. That's one of the criteria that we use for selecting breeder queens. We try to find those queens that have outproduced other hives in the apiary. You have to be careful about that because it's a tricky calculus. You know, foragers drift, right? So if you've got your colonies arrayed adjacent to one another and all the entrances are faced in the same direction, not unlike this photograph that has been shared with us here, and the colony on the far left-hand side is closer to the nectar source than the colony on the right-hand side, you may end up with the colony on the left-hand side producing more honey, not because it's better at honey production, but because a lot of the returning foragers from the colony on the right-hand side end up coming back to the colony on the left-hand side just because it's closer and they're exhausted. Okay? So be careful about that. If you're trying to select bees that produce the most honey, you need to try to control for those kinds of variables. Let me see, what else can I tell you about maximizing honey production? We've talked about strong bees. We've talked about adequate supering, maybe supering to the extreme if you're really trying to maximize honey production. We've talked about harvesting honey to take honey away from them so that they'll continue to forage avidly and not be complacent. We've talked about providing them an upper entrance. We've talked about moving them to new honey flows if the current honey flow ends. I think that, to my way of thinking, that kind of covers the landscape with respect to the most important things to do to maximize honey production. There are other little techniques that we could talk about almost ad infinitum, but it's far better to do that in the bee yard with colonies where we can like look at things more carefully and have a hands-on experience. And I'm sorry that I'm not prepared tonight to do that for you. But I'm just not. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, though, about things that I've said. And if anybody wants to take me up on some of this advice I've given and say you're wrong, I've seen other things that are contrary to what you're telling me, I'll be happy to talk about that further as well. So I don't want this to come across as me sermonizing so much as I want it to be a conversation about my experiences, the things that I think I've learned, and then hear from you about what your experiences have been. And if you want to share with me anything that you've got to say, I'll be happy to listen to it. We can talk about it. You may provoke me to other thoughts about things that I might be able to share that I've failed to, pardon me, make part of my presentation thus far.
Yeah. So Danny, we have a couple more questions in the chat box if you want to
okay. Sorry.
Roll through those first.
Oh, absolutely. You can harvest honey a comb at a time. That is just perfectly fine. So if all you want to do is get yourself 2 or 3 extra combs or 2 or 3 extra sheets of foundation and pull honey out a comb at a time. My dad used to go out when I was a little boy. One of my first experiences with him traveling around central Texas, particularly into the area around San Marcos, about this time of year, where we moved some of the bees after package production had ended, and they'd get on a huge UBAM clover flow and horsemint flow in that part of the world. Bee balm, another name for horsemint. We didn't have enough supers to go around back in those days because we hadn't invested in supers to the extent that we subsequently did. So he'd take a pickup truckload of supers out with him, and he'd spend the day driving around the bee yards, and he'd pull a comb at a time out of colonies and use the empty combs on his truck and come back home with a pickup truck that was, you know, the springs were bent so badly that the bumper was practically dragging the ground on the way home. But I mean, if you want to harvest honey a comb at a time, you can produce a huge amount of honey that way. And you can avoid some of the expense of the extra equipment if you don't want to go for that. So the configuration of colonies can be endlessly variable, right? So I'm going to refrain from telling you what I recommend. I'm going to tell you I've done it several ways, right? So a lot of my colonies are double deeps, and then I'll have 2 or 3 or 4 honey seepers on top of that. When we moved bees to North Dakota and Montana, I don't do that anymore, but when we did, our honey production colonies moved north as a single brood chamber and a single super, with the queen, fully able to access both. And we would, routinely produce 130 plus pound honey crops from those truckloads of bees that we'd move north in that configuration. We'd just have to add the supers to them and then start extracting honey about the 4th of July and put empties back on them. Tell us about your company's history. Okay, well, the Weavers have been in beekeeping for over 130 years at this point. And if you take it back on my great-grandmother's side, her brother was keeping bees in Grimes County in 1878, about 10 years before he gave 10 hives as a wedding present to his sister, Florence Summerford Weaver, and the man she married, Zach Weaver, who then started Weaver Apiaries and made that a family business. And unfortunately, many of the old photographs and much of the old documentation perished in a house fire that burned down the original Weaver house back in the 1930s, when somebody moved the kerosene drum from the front porch to the position where the gasoline drum had been, and moved the gasoline drum to the position where the kerosene drum had been, and didn't tell grandmother about it. She filled the kerosene lanterns with gasoline and set the place on fire. But everybody got out alive, but not much of the other stuff was salvaged. So I don't have a lot of photographs, but I've got one that I really treasure where the whole family's in the front yard. And you can see that the apiary is right there at the house. And they're extracting honey, they're pressing foundation, and they're moving bees all at the same time. So they've got colonies in a wheelbarrow, they're taking honey off, and they're putting it in an extractor. And my grandfather's turning an old foundation press to squeeze rendered wax into fresh foundation to make new comb with. So, and that photograph probably dated from the late 1890s is my guess. He was clearly a young boy at the time. So we've been involved in beekeeping for a long time. Back in those days, beekeeping was one of the things we did. My family was actually more famous in the 19th century for having the first mechanized haymaking equipment west of the Mississippi. And so they made hay, if you will, all over this part of Texas. And then beekeeping became the better part of the business because my grandfather liked honeybees and his brothers and sisters liked honeybees. And my great-grandfather began to like honeybees more than he did making hay, because they're just so fascinating to work with. My grandfather is the one who turned queen rearing into a commercial enterprise. We'd always reared queens for our own use and for other Texas beekeepers around us, but my grandfather went into the business and quickly made a name for himself through selling queens nationally and internationally starting in the 1920s. When my father was a little boy, we became some of the earliest migratory beekeepers. We would put our colonies on trucks and trains and move them to Colorado into the San Luis Valley, which is one of the first irrigated places in the western United States that was used to grow crops further north, apart from Washington and Oregon and California. So my dad can tell stories about, riding trucks full of bees across Rattan Pass when he was a little boy. And then my dad was the sole beekeeper left during World War II when all the other men went off to war. And he graduated high school early at 15 and then ran the queen rearing enterprise and the beekeeping enterprise with his father for several years during World War II. So that's how he got to be such a great beekeeper, is because he just had to go do it. And I might add that my grandfather, before he went into the business commercially producing queen honeybees, had been hired by a prominent Texas beekeeper, Mr. Graham, who kept bees further north, closer to Waco and Tawakoni, if you know where that is. And anyway, my dad came north to work with him because he wanted to learn more about queen production. And Mr. Graham was going to raise some queens. And Roy Weaver Sr. thought, well, that's how I'm going to learn it. And so he went up there, and Mr. Graham gave him a horse, or no, it was a mule and a wagon, and said, Roy, here's a map of where the bees are. I want you to go raise queens for me. And that was the extent of the training that he got. So he had to learn how to do it himself. And he got rather good at it, though. So, you know, that's just kind of like, I think, a lesson in beekeeping that we can all benefit from. Just don't be afraid to go do it, right? Because you're going to get better at it if you just go do it. You'll be better at maximizing honey production if you get out there this year and try to do it. See what works, see what doesn't. You know, I can sit here and pontificate all I wish, but you might learn something completely different if you just go out and do it. So make sure and get out and get in the bees and do what you can to maximize honey production. Now, I got involved in beekeeping pretty early in life because my dad put a queen nuke mating yard in our backyard when he built a house off Farm Road 2. The second farm road in Texas was right there in Lynn Grove after Ranch Road 1 where Lyndon Johnson grew up. And don't ask me why that's the case, but it is. And so they're living on Farm Road 2. I had a queen nuke mating yard in my backyard, and I was out goofing around, if not helping, pretty early in life. And when I turned about 9 years old, my dad had decided I'd watched enough Saturday morning cartoons, so I got a weekend job helping with the queen rearing. And then I worked off and on in the family business up and through the time that I went to high school and college and then graduate school and law school. I never really got away from beekeeping. And then I decided, you know what? It's not a bad life. And I came back to it. I'm glad I did. So that was probably more than you wanted to hear about the family history of beekeeping. But I think if I'm lucky enough to have one of my sons decide to stay in the family business and they talk about what I did, well, I think if I have a feather in my cap, it was helping develop a population of honeybees that was tolerant of varroa mites and resistant to honeybee viruses to the extent that they could cope with those things on their own, and you don't have to worry about it. So we rely a lot on genetics. Bees on a train. What's that, Jackson? Yeah, good idea, Laura. I'm not hearing anybody. Is somebody talking?
I can hear you.
Okay, all right.
All right, any other questions for those of you on the phone? The chat box is open. There is one question about what tricks do you have for encouraging comb building on foundation?
What should you do to encourage comb building on foundation?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I like wax foundation a lot. So I think you don't have to do much to encourage comb building on wax foundation. For plastic foundation, even if it's wax coated, in my experience, they're not going to be very good at drawing foundation, especially on the edge of the super. So rotate your combs in. They'll treat the foundation on the outer edges of the super as sidewalls to the colony rather than as foundation. So once they've drawn foundation in the middle, and you've got some drawn foundation, take those empty, undrawn frames from the outer edge of the super, work them in, work drawn comb from the middle out. And that will encourage them to build more comb, even on plastic foundation, much more quickly than they would otherwise.
Okay. And then another question around the dearth. Can you tell us a bit about when is the dearth? How do you identify you're about to go into the dearth, and when should you feed bees?
Okay. Well, and let me also say that I see Devin's question too about when is it too late in the season to start? Is that too late in the
That's a
season?
good question too. Go ahead.
Is that the question?
There's that one too.
When is it too late to start keeping bees? It's never too late to start until bees aren't producing brood anymore. So, you know, I start new colonies as late September, early October. Now, I've got to make sure they're going to be on a flow, a pollen flow and or a nectar flow if I'm going to start a new colony then. And only in certain parts of the world are they. But many parts of the Houston area happen to be in that territory. So you can get away with starting a new colony even in the fall in Texas, particularly in the Houston area. Okay, the dearth. So, you know, well, there can be more than one dearth, number one. So remember that when you're harvesting honey, you don't want to take every drop of honey away from the colony. Leave some with them, right? I mean, they need it. You're never going to provide food that's as nutritious and healthy for them as the honey that they've made. So try to make sure that you don't harvest all the honey out of the brood chambers at least, or if not, then if they're sitting there as a single brood chamber and a single super above that, leave that super with them. Don't take it all the way down to a one story. Those would be my number one recommendations. But if you decide the honey's too valuable, too precious, you didn't make much this year and you want to rip them all the way down to a one story, then you ought to feed them some more. But if they go into the dearth with, 35 or 40 pounds of honey on board, there's no emergency about feeding them. And they may well go on a fall honey flow later. So I'm not one of these people that believes in, okay, the minute they stop making honey, you got to start feeding. No. To me, that kind of beekeeping is too aggressive and it's too expensive if you've got many colonies. So let them do what they're going to do, and you needn't necessarily immediately give them full feeders of syrup as soon as the honey flow's over with. How do you know? Let me see. Do I feed pollen substitute? I do not feed pollen substitute. I count on them getting the normal cues from the surrounding world about when to raise brood. And my own view is if the colony doesn't get the cue to raise brood from the plants blooming around them, they probably shouldn't be raising brood. It's probably a good idea for the colony to minimize their population if there's going to be a sustained dearth period, right? So you might be careful about those kinds of interventions. I know they're very popular in beekeeping today. In my estimation, they backfire as often as not. From the photo shared earlier, did you say the entrances should be rotated? They needn't be. I would do that if I had my colonies arranged that way. I'd probably have that middle entrance rotated the opposite direction. Most of my colonies are on pallets. So I have two colonies side by side facing the same way. They're sitting back to back with other colonies facing the opposite way. So I don't practice what I preach, but let's see. How do you know when to split your hives? Well, if your colony is on a honey flow and you don't have any more honey supers and they're continuing to make honey and you would like another colony of bees, that's an excellent time to split a colony. There's no better time to split a colony than on a honey flow. Otherwise, you split your colony when it's big and you're ready to do it. You're not always ready to make a split. Maybe you need to get more equipment. Maybe you need to get a queen. Maybe you need to think about where you're going to put that hive. But, as long as your colony's big and strong, and by big and strong, I mean, don't go splitting a colony with fewer than 5 combs of brood and bees. It's not big enough. You're just going to shoot yourself in the foot in all likelihood. And you're going to end up with 2 very weak colonies, maybe tenuously surviving rather than one healthy colony. On the other hand, if you've got a brood chamber full of bees and brood. You know, if you've got 7, 8 combs of brood, whether that's in one brood chamber or 2, you've got plenty of brood to use to split with. 6 or 7 is okay. Fewer than 5, I wouldn't do it. All right.
All right. Well, looks like we've got most of the questions from the chat box. Any more? It's your last chance. As you can hear, we've got lots of experience on the line today. All right. Well,
Thanks
any
for having
parting
me.
thoughts?
I enjoyed being part of your group. Way to go, and having such a vibrant organization.
Thank you. We're so happy to have you today, Danny, and especially virtually. We really appreciate it.
Yes, of course. Pleasure being here. You all have a great evening.
Thank you. All right. Let me go ahead and continue on. And thank you all for listening in, but also participating with the chat and asking questions. Of course, it helps Danny so much, but also everyone who's on the phone today and listening has lots of questions, and I'm sure you had the same questions others did as well. So thank you for asking. There's no silly questions here. We want to make sure everyone gets the information and you feel like you've gotten a lot out of our speaker, but also out of our community. So next up is our raffle, and we have quite a few things to raffle today. Let me get my list out here. Let's see here. Oh, where'd it go? Okay, so our first raffle is for our top bar hive. So Nicole, you want to tell us who is the lucky winner?
Yes. We only had 9 people enter our raffle through the steps, so
small group.
Your chances were very high to win the top bar hive. You guys need to read the steps. Just saying. Yeah, just a small plug. It is Peggy Tinky.
Wonderful.
So we will be in touch with you. Joe will be in touch with you for your top bar hive. Congratulations.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Our next raffle is for a smoker. Hopefully everyone has one.
Do you want to do all 3 items and then the person can pick just in case they don't need one of these things or they're more interested in one than the other?
That would be perfect. So
Okay.
Our last 3 options are a smoker, a ticket to World Bee Day, or a bag feeder. So Nicole, who is our lucky next raffle winner?
I have to count. And people keep changing the amount. Like I had a number of participants, but people keep leaving and coming in and leaving.
You can't win.
Up my random number generator. Oh my gosh! You guys just stay put just for 1 second. I got 8 winners, and I'm like, no. All right, here we go. Oh, it's at the very end. So 150, 940. All right, Erin McLean.
Oh, where's Erin?
Erin, are you with us? This might be harder than it sounds. If they're not paying attention.
Wave your hand.
Oh no, Erin McLean. Going once. I'm gonna move.
No, she's on.
Oh, she's here. What item would you like? It's okay. Your mic doesn't have to work. That's cool. We have a smoker, a ticket to World Bee Day, which is tomorrow. It's an all-day conference, but you can watch it at your leisure. Or the Ziploc baggie feeder for on top of your hive. Get to pick one. And while she's doing that, I'm going to generate another number.
Everyone stay put.
Right? Oh, they keep leaving. It's good stuff, man. Why would you leave? She doesn't want it. you can attend World Bee Day. It would be great. All right, fine. Let me count then. All right, I have to get the chat away and it will make this much faster. Perry Harrell. Perry.
Perry, you out there?
Perry Morse?
I'm here.
Yay, Perry,
I'm here.
what's up? What one of those things would you like?
The feeder.
All right. Gotcha.
Awesome.
Can I tell a quick story?
Go for it, because I have time.
Okay. Today I was looking out the window, checking my bees about noon, and there was a green lizard on the front of the deep. So I said, what's he going to do? He kept watching bees coming in and out, in and out, in and out, and finally he left off, and hit a bee in midair, knocked it down, and ate it.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
They do that. They do that. They can't eat them all. That's what I think.
No.
Blizzard.
All right. I have our next winner. It is Laura Mullen.
Oh,
Oh, Laura.
yeah.
What a gift.
Awesome. And I was just thinking how long a smoker lasts. Is the smoker still available?
Yes, it is.
I'll take the smoker.
Got it. All right. The last one, I think it's the best prize. It's World Bee Day. We have 2 of our members speaking at World Bee Day, so that's pretty awesome. That's just amazing. And what we'll do is we'll send your information, send you the link so you can log in and do all that stuff. We got it. All right, it's right in a row. Megan Turner. Are you with us? Megan. I can unmute you, Megan. Hello, Megan. Hear us?
Megan, are you there?
I muted her.
Oh, shoot.
Oh, shoot, you're cool.
You're there.
Congratulations, Megan. You're going to be attending World Bee Day.
Yay! Thank you, guys.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I was trying to chat, but I think I was sending messages to somebody.
It's cool. It's
Sorry about that.
cool.
We're all learning. It's fine.
doing the best we can. All right.
Thank you. Very excited.
Awesome. Okay, I think that's it for the raffle. Anything else, Sandy?
No, that's it. Our next meeting, of course, is June 16th, 3rd Tuesday of next month. We're planning probably on another virtual meeting event like this, unless the whole world opens up again, we'll see. But this seems to be working well for us at the moment. So thank you so much. And thank you, Nicole. Thank you for Danny. We're so excited. And Joe also, and of course, Shelly on the phone. All of you, we're so glad to see you today. And thanks for attending the Houston Beekeepers Association meeting. Have a lovely week and a wonderful World Bee Day.
Thank you all.